Hello. Welcome to a new Rockbot class. Today we're going to see how to call a child robot and what it's used for. Alright, first and foremost, let's take the example from the previous class. If you haven't seen it, it's a good idea to go check it out, because what we're basically going to do is call a child robot so we can divide tasks according to the robots. That is, why? Because I have a main robot, which in this case is this one, right? But if I want to make a more organized and efficient robot, the ideal thing is to split up the different actions or tasks of the robot into different robots. Child robots, in this case. For example, if I have to use web actions, Excel actions, and email actions, the ideal thing is to separate the web actions into one robot, the Excel actions into another robot, and the email actions into yet another robot. Alright, for that we're going to use the following example. Here I have the login, obviously, and if you notice, when I log in, what I need to do is assign that result to a variable, that is, validate the action. How do I do this? Remember that to validate an action, what I need to do is use an if statement to perform the validation, call that variable I'm using, and do the respective validation to place the different commands either inside the if block or the else block. So, what are we going to do now? We're going to call a new robot to be able to carry out the validation task. So, what we're going to do is, we're going to call and we're going to name it validate Gmail, for example, right? So, I create that robot and what I'm basically going to do now is, I'm going to perform that validation task inside this robot. Why? We'll see in a moment. Look, I've already created the if statement and inside here, so now I'm going to delete this. So, keep in mind that after the action of connecting comes the validation robot. Now let's see how that's done. Alright, let's do the following validation. We're going to do the inverse validation. Why do I want to do an inverse validation? Because basically, what I achieve with inverse validation is that I don't end up creating nested if statements, IFS inside IFS, because remember that if, for example, I have to validate the actions of, in this case, the email, what I'm going to do is basically take the result and, if I validate it the conventional way, I have to put res here and inside these command blocks, put all the actions I need to do if it runs correctly, send the email, list the emails, read the emails, and so on, and so on. And if you notice, if after that I need to open a web page, I have to do it inside that command block and then, validate within that command block. And if you can imagine, we're going to have to keep putting IFS inside other IFS, and so on. And that's not entirely correct, since it causes confusion. It creates a nested IFS, where obviously building a bot that way isn't really efficient. So for that, we're going to do the inverse validation. That is, notice that according to Python's logic, it's always going to look for it to be true. Obviously, it's looking for true in order to execute the if, but in this case, we're telling it, we're indicating that it shouldn't look for true. In other words, if it doesn't look for true, if it doesn't find true in this case, it's going to be false if something fails, then it should execute everything inside here. And if the response is false, it means that the email hasn't been sent correctly. So, if the email isn't sent correctly, then what I need to do is shut down the service, in other words, close the application, stop the entire bot, and exit. So, with this, what I'm basically doing is, telling it that if it fails, it should perform these actions. If it doesn't fail, it should continue executing. Alright, so how do we call the bot from this bot? Let's go here. run robot from DB. This is the command. I drag it here and call it validate Gmail, right? Which is this one right here. So notice that it's going to execute the robot. It's going to validate the robot's execution with that variable. And if it's false, it's going to close Navigator. I mean, if it's false, what it's going to do, if the response is false, let's say, it's going to close Navigator, the email, and it's going to stop the whole robot, and we're going to exit the robot. The execution will end. If not false, it continues with different tasks we see here. So, if you notice, I used the variable res here, but I haven't created it in this robot. Why? Because the robot, the logic, what it does is take the variable, that is, read this variable and say, well, where do I find it? Do I find it here? No, so I go to the parent and look for it there. Is it here? Yes. What value does it have? True. If I create it, what the robot will do is basically take that variable, meaning, come here, read the variable, which in this case won't have any information. Why? Because the variable in this robot isn't holding any information. I'm not running it with any other action, so it's always going to stay empty. The one that has the valid information is the one in the parent, meaning the one in this bot. So, to prevent it from using a variable that doesn't have any information, I don't create it here, because by not creating it in this child robot, what it'll do is use the information that's in the parent robot. This applies to all robots when you're working with child robots. Remember, if I need to get information from the parent in a child robot, I don't have to create the variable in the child robot. Keep that in mind. Alright, so here I've already created a robot where I perform the validation action. I can create another robot to handle these actions and keep the parent robot clean. Now let's take a look. Alright, let's go here and, for example, let's add Gmail actions. So, I create that robot, and what I'm basically going to do is take what's here. Exactly. Let's copy it and let's bring it over here. Let's paste it here. Alright, this way we can bring this information over here. So, here I delete it. I'm going to save. Notice how quickly I transferred the information. And here, I clone this element and call the other robot, which is called Gmail Actions. And if you notice, look how easy and fast it was to create two child robots to branch out the robot's actions, and how clean the parent robot has turned out. Alright, notice that I'm still going to have the parent robot handle the information, so even though the child robots work with variables, I'm not going to create them here so that they take the information from the parent. So, let's save, and that's all for today's class. I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next class. Thank you very much.